Well, good morning, good day, good evening to everyone who's joined us today. This is a huge welcome from myself to International Trade and Prosperity Week here in the UK for 2022. My name is Chris Southworth. I'm the compere for the week. I'm the Secretary General of the ICC here in the UK. I'm delighted to bring you the theme that we're picking up from last year, where we talked about shifting the global economy to become more sustainable, more inclusive and greener. This year, we're really focused on how we build resilience in global value chains. And of course, a big part of that is all about implementation, both from a biodiversity point of view, from a climate point of view, digitalisation, and finally, responsible business conduct. So there are plenty of sessions for everybody, I hope, to engage in. We'll be bringing you practical frameworks, toolkits, best practice, and thought leadership throughout the week. So it should be a great week for everybody. Today is all about setting the scene. You know, what's the context in which we're all operating? We'll hear shortly from our ICC Global Chair, Maria Fernanda-Garza, who we're absolutely delighted to have with us. And then we'll follow through with an economic overview and some views from international boardrooms. So for everyone who's listening, please do register for your sessions, use the networking space to make contact with each other. The chat room is there for everybody to exchange views. And of course, don't forget the Q&A function if you'd like to post some questions throughout the day. We'll be watching those carefully and passing them on to the speakers. So I'm absolutely delighted if I can invite Maria to come on the screen. We're extremely lucky. Maria is in the middle of traveling, so it's a real privilege to have you with us, Maria. For those who don't know, Maria is the former chair of ICC Mexico, now our global chair, and knows us very well here in the UK. So it's absolutely fantastic to have you with us. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Chris. And my sincere thanks to ICC United Kingdom, and in particular to you, Paul, and all ICC UK team. Congratulations for putting together this very important and very timely event. It is great to join you today. The theme for this conference is in many ways ingrained in the 100+ years of the International Chamber of Commerce. As many of you will be aware, ICC was founded out of the ashes of the First World War with a vision that business could and should be force for good in the world. And perhaps more fundamentally, that cross-border commerce could be an important driver of peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. This early vision of a brighter world enabled by global trade stands in stark contrast to much of what we hear about globalization today. To that point, I was particularly struck by a recent piece in the Financial Times by the commentator John Plender, who pointed to the limitations of the German doctrine of change through trade. Developments in recent months have shown that trade had produced the wrong sort of change, Mr. Plender concluded. This line of argument has, of course, a certain instinctive attraction to it, not least in the context of the war in Ukraine and its impact on global energy and food prices. But my sense is that this conclusion needs to be set in a broader historical perspective, away from the cycle of 24/7 news and the inevitable dramatization that comes with it. Over the past 30 years, two forces have combined to mean that we are more prosperous and more interdependent than ever. The first is that the walls came down. Very few countries are now truly isolated. The changes unleashed with the destruction of the Berlin Wall have rippled around the world. In broad terms, there has been an immense political, economic, and technological convergence. Flows of information, as well as finance, goods, services, and people across borders have transformed the nature of our societies. Second, in addition to the disappearance of physical divisions, virtual barriers have also come tumbling down. with the internet providing the information system for what is now often termed hyperglobalization. All this is, I would unashamedly suggest, good news, not least since these developments have been associated with the most rapid rise in incomes in history. In a recent article, the IMF's Kristalina Georgieva highlighted that these positive forces of integration have boosted productivity and living standards, tripling the size of the global economy and lifting 1.3 billion people out of extreme poverty. And this is no small achievement. Extreme poverty, more often than not, is because people are disconnected from globalization, as they don't have the infrastructure, education, or access to benefit from new opportunities. The growth we have seen over the past 30 years in incomes and in global population are reflections of the success of trade and globalization. But while people and systems have become more integrated, increasingly making national boundaries almost irrelevant, politicians and governance systems are too often locked in fossilized structures, which have failed to keep pace with global developments. The result is that globalization has not been and is not being managed correctly. Financial crisis, pandemics, cyber attacks, climate change, and other global threats are in essence the underbelly of globalization. The more connected we are, the more we need to accept that we are exposed to transboundary risks, and that as a result, we need effective global governance. In short, the past 30 years show us that the trade can bring positive change. The real problem is the growing disconnect between the problems that bind us as a result and the ability of governments and institutions to respond effectively. Each day we are confronted by mounting evidence of this yawning governance gap, one which leaves us all unduly exposed to underbelly of globalization, and one of which often leads to journalists, commentators, and most worryingly politicians pointing to the wrong conclusions and remedies. From a business perspective, it is clear that there are a number of lessons that need to be learned, and learned urgently. To take each in general terms, the first is that most significant challenges that arise in today's world are cross-border or global in nature. And if the primary purpose of governments is to protect us, this needs to be an urgent focus of their attention. Second, by extension, none of these threats can be addressed by any one country alone. Even the most powerful and largest countries, such as the United States or China, required increased international cooperation. Even if that doesn't make for easy domestic politics, the lessons of the coronavirus pandemic show that to be true. I know some people were skeptical when ICC published modeling in early 2021, predicting that a failure to distribute COVID-19 vaccines equitably could cost the global economy trillions. But look at the continued supply chain disruptions we have seen since then that have placed an enormous drag on growth and productivity, and have played a central role in stoking inflationary pressures in many industries. As we have said many times, in the face of a threat that by its very nature knows no borders, placing national interest ahead of international cooperation is akin to shooting yourself in the foot. The third is that technological and social change are evolving at such an accelerated pace that politicians and regulators need better ways to map and track potential threats. And fourth, existing global institutions are unfit for 21st century purpose. To take one example, multilateral development banks are arguably the best resource and most powerful facet of today's global institutional system. And yet, they have proved incapable of moving beyond their original Bretton Woods mandate. Ask yourselves this: do they have an appropriate approach to risk management in today's world? Are they able to effectively channel finance to those who need it most? Have their lending criteria adapted to the severe challenges posed by climate change? The answer, as we heard from several heads of governments during the United Nations General Assembly opening last month, is a decided no. The failure, or at least the inability of the MDBs to adapt the context in which we now operate, is emblematic of a much broader challenge throughout the multilateral system. Urgent reform, or at least renewal, is required across the board. My articulation of these problems is not intended in any way to convey an overly pessimistic or even fatalistic message. Rather, to frame the unique value that I believe ICC can bring to the business community at a time when multilateralism is at such a low ebb. If you agree with me, my analysis that business needs a stronger multilateral cooperation to ensure an effective response to global challenges, from cybercrime to climate change, we have to lead from the front in proposing effective global solutions grounded in the needs of the real economy, and calling out the dangers of economic isolation and fragmented policy approaches. I believe that ICC, with our extensive global network and status as a trusted partner of key international organizations, is uniquely placed to spearhead this much needed effort. And to that end, throughout my tenure as chair, I am committing to ensure that organization plays a leading role in shaping reform of the World Trade Organization system, in driving the adoption of digital trade processes capable of making supply chains more resilient and transparent, in shining a light on the policy barriers business face in meeting global targets on climate action and the preservation of nature, in delivering rules and standards that help business navigate a rapidly changing global environment in areas such as sustainability, integrity, and digitalisation, and as well as pioneering new ways to engage businesses at the very top level of international decision-making. And I say this deeply conscious of the headwinds many businesses in our network are likely to face in the coming months, with the warning signs of a global recession now flashing bright red. You can be sure of our commitment to provide a unique value-add service to all our members as the leading trusted advocate and standard setter for global business, as your partner to champion and shape global policies capable of meeting the needs of local business. And as a business community, we are stronger together, and we are strongest on the global stage when united under ICC. Many thanks again for inviting me to speak today on today's event, and I look forward to our continued collaboration. Thank you, and back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Maria. Very, very powerful words there, and a really good reminder, actually, of what ICC is all about for those in the audience who are already ICC members or interested in what ICC does. I think Maria's just perfectly encapsulated it right there. So we wish you, I appreciate you are going to stay with us for a little bit, Maria, but we wish you safe travels to Argentina, and thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it's extremely late in the night for you. Massively grateful from our side over here. So for the audience, I'd like to now just turn to our ICC lead economist, Melanie Lalume, who's new in post this year, who's going to give us an economic overview, picking up on some of the points that Maria has just illustrated, to give us a real sense of the economics out there, what we're actually dealing with. So let's listen to Melanie now.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone that is connected. Welcome to the International Trade and Prosperity Week. My name is Mélanie Lalou, and I'm the lead economist for ICC. I would like, before starting the presentation, I would like first to thank ICC UK for inviting me to present. And today I will present you the latest economic developments, the macroeconomic forecast for this year and the one to come, but also the risk to this outlook. Let's start with this year. So what happened in 2022? 2022, we're seeing the direct impact of the war in Ukraine that is deterring the economic recovery. We're seeing that first in the industrial sectors that is suffering high energy costs and remaining supply bottlenecks, but also on the service sector. So if we remember well, the service sector really suffered during the pandemic because we couldn't spend on services and we increased our demand for goods. And when with high vaccination rate and a lower number of lockdown, demand for services increased, especially tourism. And right now, what we're seeing is that the demand for servicing is actually decelerating, and there are less order of new demand for services. The second impact that the war in Ukraine is having on the global economy is through the price channel. So energy and food pricing are reaching record level. On the energy side, we have really prices that are skyrocketing. Natural gas and coals have doubled or almost doubled since the beginning of the war, and oil prices, they have increased by at least 30%, and they remain at high level, around $90 per barrel. And it's going to be more complicated since the OPEC Plus is actually cutting its oil supply, so that will increase price in the future. First, increase the level of price, but also the volatility of prices. The second impact that the war had on prices is through fertilizer and food prices in a context of sanction, but also transport disruption of all of sorts, like transport sea disruption through the road and through the air. So that's why actually price increase really fast and have been really volatile. Luckily, the agreement through the Black Sea managed to reduce prices, but this agreement is actually ending really soon. The third channel through which the war in Ukraine is also having an impact on the global economy is through supply chains. We have to remember that Russia is one of the main providers of have a high share of market and market pricing power on several minerals such as nickel, palladium, and aluminium. What does this mean? This means that it can have an impact on the supply and on the price of those goods, and it's affecting mainly heavy industry and the manufacturing sectors. So that's what we are seeing on the graph on the left, that supply chain have eased because of the recovery of the economy, but remain significant. And on top of the war in Ukraine, we have also China that has, due to the surge of COVID cases this year, that has to impose several lockdowns, which had an impact on its manufacturing sector, which is fueling manufacturing activities in a lot of countries. And this is also reflected on freight prices, which have decreased, so related to the easing of supply chain tension, but also remain 3 times higher than pre-pandemic level. So really showing that those supply chains remain significant. And as we are seeing, we have food, energy prices that are really soaring. And what it means that it has an impact on headline inflation in all over the world, in most of the countries. For the euro area, most of its inflation is related to food and energy price increase. For the UK and the US, is about one third of overall inflation that is linked to food and energy prices, especially energy. But there are also some development on the labor market, meaning that there are shortages of labor, especially in the leisure, hospitality sectors, but also we have seen that in the beginning of the year in the transport and logistics sectors that are pushing employers to actually offer higher wages, and that are contributing to a wage inflation, which is fueling overall inflation. And in that context, so increasing inflation, but especially higher inflation expectation, central banks in every country had to intervene to control the surge of prices. And they are doing that by raising interest rate. So in this context of high uncertainty, high volatility, we're right now seeing that inflation is having an impact on private consumption. So on the business side, but also on the consumer side. And that's where we're seeing that in the confidence level, which are their lowest points since even before the pandemic for some countries. And also we're seeing that with tight labor markets, with the number of positions to fill that is really high and difficult to fulfill. What is the economic outlook for this year and the next year? So it's a gloomy outlook. I will not lie. Both the IMF and the OECD are projecting that the world might enter into recession. This is especially true for European country and for Germany. So every country that will be reliant on natural gas in Europe might or will go into recession. So 2022, a deceleration of economic activity compared to 2021. 2023, some countries will experience a deep contraction of their economic activity. In terms of inflation, policymakers are not forecasting a return to pre-pandemic levels of inflation. So inflation will remain elevated, but also broad-based. So meaning that every sectors will suffer a price increase. Now, what are the risks to this outlook? So most of the risks are on the downside. First, a cold winter would actually bring bad news to European countries. What we're seeing right now is that due to their efforts to actually increase gas storage through renewed partnership with Norway, with Algeria, to increase their access to LNG terminals, most European countries have managed to increase their gas storage for 2022. However, if demand is not reduced, those gas storage will not be sufficient for the next winter to come. So that's why the European Union is trying to reduce demand, to constrain the demand through rationing or to enterprise, but also consumers. Which sector would be most impacted? So mainly heavy industry sectors, such as steel, glass, aluminium, chemical sectors also. And this will have a ripple effect in the machinery and also the automotive sectors. Which country in Europe would be more impacted if there will be a colder winter? So first we have to remember there is three channels through which there is a risk for a European country. The first channel is a direct cutoff from Russia of energy supply. We know that Russia is using the energy supply as a way to create a downturn in Europe and also to have higher prices. So first, the direct effect is the cutoff. The countries that are mostly impacted are the countries that don't have access to LNG terminals, so mainly Germany and other Eastern European countries such as Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Second, the second channel through which it has an impact is through supply chain. So as we have seen is that Germany will experience a contraction, and some countries are linked to Germany, to German supply chains, especially Eastern European countries. So they will suffer from the recession in Germany because it's lower external demand. And the last one is high prices, and the country that will be affected are the country with the star, are the country who actually have a higher share of natural gas in their energy mix. So that's why the European Union is trying to push to increase the mix toward more renewable energy, or maybe sometimes nuclear energy. Make sure that the strategy of Russia is actually to break down or to play with the European solidarity, knowing that some countries will suffer more than others. The second risk to the outlook is China. Why China? So first, China has experienced this year an intense drought, which has an impact on its hydropower resources and on its electric sectors. But that has a ripple effect also on the manufacturing sectors. Second, we mentioned previously the increase of COVID cases, which has led to several lockdowns in many cities, and that had an impact on the manufacturing sectors in China, but also in the world, because so many companies have their manufacturing sites in China. So this has an impact. And the third one is the housing market, which has experienced a sharp deceleration this year through several companies going bankrupt. So the deceleration of the housing market is actually having an impact on the construction sector, but also on the manufacturing sector, as we are seeing that in the graph on the left. And it's the first time, as a result, it's the first time for the past 4 decades that China will experience its weakest growth rates, which is around 3%. And the third one is the challenge for developing an emerging market, and is related to tightening of monetary policy. We have seen that to control surging inflation, central bank, especially the Fed, had to increase interest rate. Why this is a risk for low-income country or emerging market? By increasing interest rates, it can lead to currency depreciation in several emerging markets. If they don't have enough reserve to mitigate that shock, this would lead to an increase of the import bill, but also of the debt services. And for some countries which came out of the pandemic with higher debt level and also lower fiscal space, there might be a trade-off between servicing debt or trying to tackle the food crisis by providing transfer to the most vulnerable population. So that's why those countries that are already in the distress are the most at risk of also facing a food and hunger crisis. And the last risk, if my slide can go, is geopolitical tensions that are shaping or reshaping supply chains. Here, it's more on the medium to long-term outlook. And what we have seen because of the war in Ukraine is that Russia is doing a pivot to the east. So its new strategy is to compensate for lower demand of energy in Europe and to try to find a new partner on East and on the Middle East. So that's why we're seeing an increase in imports and exports from China and to China of Russia. So imports have increased from 51% in the first 8 months of the year, and it's mainly energy. Those two have different strategies. So Russia pivoting to the east, and China is more trying to, that because its hydropower sector really decelerated or couldn't went down this year, they are trying to diversify their source of energy. And that's why they are trying to also use Russia, which is providing cheaper natural gas. The second debate or discussion that we are hearing is about friendshoring, enshoring, or reshoring of activity. Right now, at least in the data number, we're not seeing a clear trend on that. But what we are seeing is that companies are trying to increase resilience of their supply chains. How they are doing that? First, by increasing their stocks of inputs, but also of outputs. Of inputs because of high prices, and of outputs because to make sure that they will meet the demand. And finally, the last point is due to geopolitical tension, especially between the US and China, companies are also adopting a strategy trying to diversify their supplier. So they will remain in the same region, but they will try to find a new provider. And this is the case, for instance, of Vietnam, which has experienced an increased level of attention from companies. And it's more a China plus one strategy. So companies will remain in China, but in case tensions flares up, they will go also, they will have Vietnam as a backup. And especially those two countries are also complementary. So that would be the tension. Now I have finished. I hope if you have any question, do not hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for listening. Bye.
Well, some sobering words there from Melanie. I don't think probably a surprise for many of us attending this conference, but good to hear that summary from her. Before I hand over to our next panel, where we'll be talking about some of these frictions and tensions in the global economy, let me just take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, JTI, Money2Go, and Inigio, for helping enable this conference to happen. It's hugely welcome and very much grateful from the team at ICC. So without any further delay, I'd like to just invite our chairman here at ICC United Kingdom, Paul Drexler, CBE, who will be the moderator for the next session, where we'll hear some views and perspectives from the boardrooms. Some of us don't get access to those boardrooms all the time, so I think understanding the insights of what boardrooms are discussing is actually really important for all of us in the implementation, which we'll be talking about for the rest of the week. Paul, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Chris. And look, everybody, good morning. What a fantastic start to our week. We've heard from the chairman of ICC Global, Maria, a fantastic insight into the world of international trade and passion for something I think we all share, and that is the role of ICC in helping the world to be a better place. I'm a passionate believer that business is a force for good. That's one of the reasons I'm here this morning. I'll be making the case with a fantastic panel. And what I expect is from a business panel that you will be excited by the optimism, because that, of course, is what we bring as an ingredient to global culture and global trade. Before I introduce the panel, just let me, first of all, share some of the headlines from what I think we've heard so far this morning. We have, without question, lifted billions of people out of extreme poverty over the past 50 years through global cross-border trade of goods and services. Globalization has spread fantastic opportunity, but also risk, and it created huge interdependencies between regions and nations and supply chains. And from one perspective, made the world a much better place. But also, as was highlighted by Maria, there has also been an increase in global inequality. And to a great extent, all of these factors are coming together to put globalization and international cross-border trade in the spotlight. And it's for people at this conference this week to think about these challenges and demonstrate that we are a force for good and can make a good difference. And as I was reading the Financial Times this morning, as indeed Maria was recently, Rana Fuhar, who is one of the brilliant reporters, said two things. Our system of neoliberal globalization has created more wealth on a global scale over the past half century than ever before. But there has also been huge growth in inequality within many countries. We are, concludes Rana, headed towards a new post-neoliberal paradigm in which values, rather than just everyday low prices, become a more important consideration in economic policy decisions. So, we're challenged, and I think that's a great reason to be together this week. Before maybe I'll bring the panel in and then I'll just share a few thoughts. I mean, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome such a distinguished panel. The bios are available on the program, on the event website, but let me just give a brief welcome to each. First of all, I could invite Günaydın, Ve Vosgelden, good morning and welcome to Chris Gaunt, OB, Chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in Turkey, to join me. Chris is operating right in the middle of West and East, and I'm sure will bring some unique views to our discussion this morning. Good morning and welcome. Willkommen noch, Dr. Holger Bingman, President of ICC Germany, a huge and diverse insight into business, economics and politics in Germany, in the European Union, and indeed as a leader of understanding and business development between Germany and the Emirates. And finally, a good morning and welcome and great appreciation to Paul McComb, who works for one of the busiest departments in the civil service in the UK, in the Department of International Trade, with a special focus on exports. So we're going to talk today as a panel about some of the global trends and opportunities. And I thought I'd just sort of set the scene for my colleagues here today in terms of certainly the boardrooms that I sit in. What has crossed our mind in the past year or so? Huge geopolitical shifts, leadership changes in the West and the East, moves to the right, moves to the left, populist leaders, autocratic leaders, stuff going all over the place. And it feels like a very busy time geopolitically. I think business leaders are often portrayed as extreme capitalists. Most of the business leaders I know have big hearts and do care about inequality, do care about hunger, poverty, and disease. And we've had that to contend with. And still there in the background, with the temperature going up every day, of course, is the challenge of climate change. So that's some of what's in our boardrooms. And some of that, of course, is the normal course of events. But it is worth taking a moment, I think, to think about COVID-19 was a huge shock to our system, as was the aftermath around supply chain stresses. We were just getting over that. Then came along the war in Ukraine, and now we're sitting with some big political change in the West. I think all of us around the table today can share stories about thinking about what will happen in our country and in our region as political change happens. And then as we're dealing with all of that, you then get, as a result of war in Ukraine, an energy supply and cost crisis, as Melanie brilliantly illustrated a moment ago, which together with other issues has been fueling inflation and bringing social issues in terms of cost of living as well as economic issues. And this is all the stuff that boardrooms are dealing with. And it's probably a long time since many boardrooms have had to be thinking about what the cost of living means to their employees, to their customers, and others to the degree we do now. But I guess what I'd say is I've never met a business leader who wasn't an optimist. And if he or she wasn't an optimist, they probably weren't in the same role the following day. That's the optimism is in the blood, the desire to overcome problems. And I think genuinely, if we're going to overcome climate change, seize the opportunities of technology, capitalize on the brilliant possibilities from bioscience and pharmaceuticals, and automate our manufacturing systems, behind each one of these challenges, often as you know, what we see are, of course, opportunities. So I hope the panel this morning have arrived with a glass half full to talk to this group of people. I'm delighted to have you all on board. And I'm going to start with my friend from Germany, Dr. Holger Bingmann. Give us some perspectives, Holger, on what's the big picture in Germany in terms of politics at the moment, just maybe headlines, and then what were the priority issues in your boardrooms that you're debating and considering? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, very much for introducing me so politely. And yes, of course, the glass is more than half full. And yes, of course, optimism remains. But I think it comes, as it comes closer to winter time, it comes on a political side to a difficult time. I think during summer, everybody was still some kind of relaxed, and even having, as Melanie showed, the gas in a sufficient way in Germany. People are getting more and more scared, and this is the problem for politics. People see their bills for energy, gas, heating, and also in some cases this comes to dramatic quantities of pricing. On the one side, on the normal population on our side, on the other side, for smaller and bigger companies. I know some energy intense companies who are really getting into let's say not a catastrophic but a real dramatic situation, and I think this comes to or leads to a certain pressure on politics in our country, what to do exactly, and what to do means more is always a little bit problematic. If you have a new government like we have, of course it's a year old, but after 16 years of an old government, we have a new government and we have a great or a big coalition in there. And this is always a little bit, let's call it problematic, not dramatic, but it's problematic finding strong decisions or making strong decisions. And so even having the discussion, originally we decided to get out of nuclear energy by the end of the year. It's mid of October, and we are not quite sure what will happen with this on the 1st of January on. So this is dramatic because it would add another problem for economies that we don't even think of. So our government is the problem, and that the fear or the constraints are arriving on a lot of people living in my country. Then, of course, it comes to a situation of inflation, which we saw, and it comes to the point that the Germans, which was cited on this weekend, rather look for recession than more inflation. So this is a dramatic point for policy. And if you look on what are the major topics for us as businessmen, of course, it's the word that is most used, it's resilience. We lost all resilience, we lost it in energy. And I'm a little bit shocked by the map which showed Germany being on a red flag. But it's true, we are in the middle, and we have been so much depending on one side of supply that all the friendly visits to Qatar and to Dubai of all our chancellor and ministers will not equivalent the shortage that we are looking from our eastern supply. On the other hand, we have the resilience in supply chain that has already been discussed, which leads to another cost effect we know, which leads to higher stocks, will lead to another cost effect. We have the energy costs, and last point from my side, more generally is we lost so many friends throughout the last 12 or 24 months. So it is not only Russia. We are a little bit heavily struck by China. Where are our traditional, or where are our new friends? So we have to look for free trade agreements. We are in competition. It is your country who is also looking for free trade agreements. So we are running a little bit in a certain competition for doing something in the MENA region, doing something in the Gulf, in Africa. I think India will be one of the winners in the future. So what is German economy doing, who lost about 18 billion direct invest in Russia? On the other hand, I see from my entrepreneur side, association side, there's a big approach of what can we do? Where can we go? Well, help us, give us some advice. So still open for new business.
Look, it's Monday morning, Holger. I'm going to come back to you for the glass half full piece of this, but I think that analysis is spot on, and of course will be shared across many boardrooms in Germany. I think you've also emphasized in several ways there an important point that Maria made, which is why were we as an ICC founded? It was to create better relationships, to build allies across the world. And I think this is the first time we've seen the seismic shifts in some of those relationships.
And it's so necessary. Keep talking to each other and maybe talking even more intensely. So thank you very much.
There was a very famous British politician called Churchill, who I think said, jaw, jaw, not war, war. So it is good. But look, just for now, Holger, thank you so much. Look, I'm delighted to welcome Chris from Turkey, sitting in such an interesting part of the world. Chris, you can see so much more of the world than we can. You're in the middle of it. So maybe just a little overview in terms of what it feels like, what it is like from political point of view in Turkey at the moment. And then if we were sat in a Turkish boardroom, what would the key agenda items and priorities be? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and taking on board what Holger was actually saying. I mean, the world is spinning in the wrong direction at the moment, and I think we're all suffering from that. And we need to get it spinning in the right direction. And speaking to Turkish companies and also to UK companies who have been well established in Turkey for a number of years, the problem that they're facing at the moment because of the economic situation in Turkey, where inflation is extremely high. Officially, it's beyond 82%, and officially, it's probably in the region of 140%. So it's affecting everybody, and it's making life very difficult for boardrooms in Turkey to actually make decisions and to plan ahead, because the Turkish lira is continuing to devalue. So costs are unpredictable in terms of what's going to happen in 2023. So there's a lot of concern, and on top of it all, as you've highlighted and we've discussed, we've got the problem in Ukraine with Russia, and Turkey, because of its geographic location, is affected by that quite deeply, and we're seeing a number of conflicting and mixed messages coming from the Turkish government as to where they actually sit in this relationship with Russia and Ukraine, which also causes concern in that many Turkish companies have got big investments in Turkey, particularly in construction, also have a good relationship with Ukraine as well. So yes, it's difficult at this moment in time to actually predict, what the near-term future holds, and businesses are now holding back because we also have an election in about 18 months' time, and electioneering has already started at a pace here in Turkey, and the result probably is more unpredictable than it's ever been before. So, again, businesses have got that other dynamic to consider and factor into how they deal with the headwinds that are coming down the line. So yeah, it is very complicated, and Turkey, strategically, geopolitically, for many hundreds of years, has always been the centre of what's gone on between Europe and the Near East. So yeah, it is complicated. As I mentioned to Paul earlier, I was with Kenan Palyo as the Consul General and Regional Trade Commissioner based in Istanbul. He has a responsibility for 14 countries, which stretch across Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, and the Central Asian republics. And in Gaziantep, we're down there talking to the mayor and some trade chambers, and their concerns at the moment. And one of the messages that they were giving to us in relation to how can UK help with some of the issues that they're dealing with. The top of the agenda was sustainability, which was quite interesting, because they've recognised quite rightly that as their companies in that region go forward, they're going to need sort of green documentation if they're going to continue their exports into Europe, particularly because Turkey is also part of the EU green strategy, so they have to be compliant with EU's green strategy. And if you compare the Turkish green strategy that's been produced and the EU green strategy, there are gaps. So Turkey's got some catching up to do. And I think Turkish businesses are very aware of how they need to accelerate their processes in order to get ESG and global sustainability goals embedded, and fully understand what their requirements will be when they have to become compliant. So yeah, it's interesting the way that the board's thinking.
Thank you.
As far as UK companies,
I'll come to Chris. I'm just going to keep you on the Turkish side for a moment, if I can. Yeah. We will come back to sustainability later, if we can do that. But let me bring in Paul, and then we'll all crack into discussion. But Paul, what an interesting time to be a senior civil servant in the UK. So it's great you find the time to be with us this morning. For those who mightn't be right up to speed, so what's going on? What are the macro issues in the UK at the present time? And then coming right down to what we're trying to do in terms of growth in international trade, what sort of discussions are you having with businesses?
Paul, thank you. And thanks to the International Chambers for having me along today. I mean, actually, there's a lot of common themes that have already been discussed there around rising energy costs, the impact on prices, getting inflation under control, cost of living, how that plays through. I mean, of course, you've heard it from the Prime Minister in the UK. Our focus is on how do we get back to growth, but equally there is a job to do in front of us around cost of living and stabilising the economy. So I think I'll not go into great depth with all of those issues because they're as true here as they are for other countries, frankly. You described before this department as one of the busiest in the British government, and we are incredibly busy. When we were set up a few years ago, we were told, if you want to do a trade deal, you could do about 2 or 3 a year if you're lucky. We've probably got about 7 negotiations running, covering India, GCC, Mexico, Canada, in addition to deals that we've already sort of secured that we're putting into practice. So there's 2 things I'd say that are on our mind as a department. First of all, because we are not a sort of central Whitehall policy department in the classic sense, so we don't own the policy for how you handle imports, we don't own the policies around sort of the trade in sort of healthcare or the regulation that goes around a lot of things that get involved in trade. Because we don't own all of that, we've always seen ourselves as a part of the business community in a way. So we work extensively with all the business representative groups, the chambers, the CBI, the Federation of Small Businesses here, and we're very much in listening mode with them to find out what are the things that they think we should be doing And where we can have an impact on that, we will do something. And where we need to go and lobby other bits of Whitehall to say, hey, do you know that particular policy or that thing you're doing is stepping in the way of progress, then we put our energy into behind the scenes, trying to make some movement on that. I mean, what's interesting for me, Paul, is that if you reflect back over the probably last 3 or 4 years, businesses are definitely finding things out the hard way in terms of global supply chains and how it all works. During the preparations for the new trading deal with Europe, lots of businesses had to really learn about their supply chains, where things were, who they were dependent on. And to be blunt, I think a lot of businesses didn't know. They learned because they had to learn, because they didn't know what they needed to adjust. I think COVID massively amplified the need to understand. Of course, Ukraine has got us into a different space again. I think the biggest challenges, and this is where I think equally ICC have a big role to play, businesses want reliable insight across the world, what's going on, and through networks, you can share information, you can share insight, and they get a better feeling from perhaps the noise they read in the media and the truth that people and businesses are seeing on the ground. I think the second challenge we feel is we are so void of data to really understand interdependencies. And I go back to my comment about we're finding out the hard way. And I've been on many panel discussions with different sectors. Make UK struck me in particular, which is the manufacturing bodies. And you can see businesses are starting to say, listen, if we share what we've all know, the chances are we're all going to succeed. If we lock down and we sort of think we can go it alone, then we're probably in a bit of trouble. So I think building that insight, building good solid data on which to make decisions, I think are probably the biggest challenges for international trade, and we'll get into some of that, I'm sure, in the discussion.
Sure. Paul, thank you for that. I mean, for obvious reasons, Paul won't be commenting on the fact that while the rest of you are dealing with the mega issues and all the challenges you've described, at the same time, we've had a pretty challenging 4 or 5 months in the UK with elections for prime ministers, deposing of prime ministers, uncertainty about prime ministers, 4 chancellors, which as you can imagine, each time a chancellor comes out with a plan, business responds and says, here's all the positives we can see in it, and then the plan's upended. So it's, if in the normal course of business, there's a lot going on at the moment, there's quite a lot of additional uncertainty playing out in the UK, which we hope will be resolved very, very, very quickly. But, you know, on the base that we have people listening from all around the world, and they're looking to us for great advice, I guess, Holger, what do you see as the greatest opportunities for business to help to grow the world economy, to overcome some of these challenges? And recognize that some are very intense short term. We will get through them. What can we do? What should be our greatest areas of focus?
I think I fully agree with Paul that, of course, sustainability is something important. But let me point a little bit more on digitalisation. I think that's the deciding point on two sides. It's one inside our company. Let's be honest, if there comes in order via fax, this is a technique that has been existing in the last decade, we will still take that order. So we are not finally digitalized, and I think that on the one side, it's inside our company. On the other hand, and this is something where ICC is really of great help to the world, it's digitalization of international trade. I think even the UK did a study on how much it might bring additional value to trade in the world, which was some billions of dollars if we make sure that the trade is well organized in a digital way. It's not only about 4 billions of paper waste per day, but it's the securing and the easing and the speeding up of trade. And this is something which as Paul mentioned, we always learn things by the hard way. I think we learned it, and we still have the picture in mind where that ship was struck in the Suez Canal, and there was this little machine trying to help it, making out. We still have that picture, and if we move on like this, it's too slow. So I think we should make use of these dramatic situations in solving our homework, and one of them, apart from sustainability, for me, it's digitalisation inside our companies and inside our international trade system.
Holger, that's a brilliant point. I think actually on a global trade basis, it was in the $1.something trillion in terms of potential benefit. The really exciting thing I think about digitalization of trade is, of course, how it opens up trade to smaller businesses and to individuals to trade so much more easily. As I've learned about this, Holger, I've been surprised about how dependent we have been on paper and documentation for international trade. It seems just unbelievable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's got to be a fantastic opportunity. Chris, what about, if you had to place 3 bets that would be the best bets to help the world economy grow, what would they be on?
Well, they'd be on communication, and I agree with Paul, and we don't have enough of it. And businesses have to have open channels of communication, whether they through government agencies or with business NGOs around the world. That's critically important, and we should all be joined at the hip. And we previously have been. I mean, Lord Green, back in 2013, launched the OBNI initiative, which connected MBOs, business NGOs with the government agency, and that was a great vision. Sadly, it dissipated over years, but I think it's time to get it back again. On SMEs and digitalization, I do have a slight concern there in that SMEs are not ready yet in terms of digitalization. There's a lot of work to be done there to get them connected. The SMEs that we talk to definitely want their hand-holding. They want to speak to people. They want reassurance because they're risk averse, and we have to provide channels where they can speak to people and also combine the digitalization initiatives with that and educate them. So yeah, communication is critical. They have to know what's going on in the country that they're looking to export to, and they've got to know what infrastructure is available for them in those countries that they can actually plug into, and we still have a lot of gaps there. The other thing is education. I'm a big believer in education. We've got to get institutions educating people about what global trade is all about. We need more young graduates coming out, getting into trade, getting into businesses that have a background in global trade. I think we don't have enough people coming through on the pipeline that really understand what it's about. And I think government and generally civil society has to understand that education is critical, and we have to bring more people into our businesses and get them to understand exactly what's required.
So Chris, 2 different points there. Maybe we just spend a moment on. There's a presumption that global trade is good. Do we need to restart that conversation with confidence to bring more people on side? I think there's a lot of people who are questioning whether global trade is good. Do we need to do more as leaders to make the case for it?
Yeah, yes, we do. And we want to create more leaders. And all our economies depend on exports and global trade. Our GDP relies on it, and we have to do. Marketing is a very important aspect of this as well. Yeah. To promote the contribution that global trade makes to our respective economies. And that's something we really have to focus on. We have to do more about.
So, Holger, just if I come back to you for a moment, if in Germany, 2 questions, I guess. It never strikes me that the SME sector in Germany is unsophisticated. So is there a big challenge around digitalization for SMEs in Germany? And second, if we did a poll, a referendum of the people in Germany today on global trade, would they be for or against? What would that picture look like?
Great question. Difficult to answer. I was just thinking of what Chris mentioned. A political leader in our country mentioned 6 weeks ago that change through trade, what we call Wandel durch Handel, is dead. So, and if a real political economic leader in policy is claiming this word, it's a horrible thing. Yes, we absolutely need to talk more about the benefits and I think the big stock listed company, they have their multinational international dependency anyhow. It's the SME, it's mostly the family owned SMEs that are a little bit reluctant now, where to go, what to do. I don't think that they are on shock because of the loss they had in Russia. No, it's much more, where should I go to? And I see from so many open questions, what would you recommend? Where should we go? Should we invest in Egypt or in the Gulf region or in India? So I think it's not the shock, it's the looking for and hopefully some resilient structures. And if there would be a poll in Germany, I'm not so positive about international trade, because people look more on their monthly energy bill now and they don't see the benefit out of international trade compared to the rising prices of international energy supply.
Very good point. And I think to all the people who were tuned in, I think there's an important takeaway there, which is the task we have as champions of international trade to make sure that we keep our allies strong and growing, not that number reduces, but we've got to adapt to the external environment as well and demonstrate that international trade is making a significant contribution. Paul McComb, where do you think we'd be in the UK? Have we got the allies that we need to grow international trade? Is the business demand for all these trade deals as strong as the political push for all these trade deals?
Listen, I think because obviously we're in a position in the UK to enter into trade negotiations as a sort of nation state, in a way it's sort of reinvigorated those trade relationships and those business relationships, which and if you look at the rate at which we are trying to get deals in place, but also some market access things. So they're not full-blown trade deals, but they're things that you can get into a discussion, be that sort of mutual recognition of qualifications or other facilitating sort of measures. Equally, we've got, I think, the history of the Commonwealth, where there's a commitment between Commonwealth countries to around getting all the trade between the nations up to 2 trillion by 2030. There's some big ambitions been set, which has sort of opened the conversation for, well, how do we make that happen? And if I could, Paul, just a couple of things to comment on the questions you put to the others. So we survey every year, particularly businesses that we think are more export ready. May not be exporting, but look on the face of it export ready. They've got a good turnover, they've got access to capital. And consistently, and even in this year's survey, there's a few big messages that come through. First of all, 70% of the people who respond, or businesses who respond, say that all they were doing was fulfilling an order. They don't see themselves as an exporter per se. 1 in 5 of them didn't export, but had something they could have exported, so they chose not to. And these reasons have been persistent. The first one is the cost of doing it. So be that tariffs or paperwork filling in. Secondly, it's knowledge. Thirdly, it's building up trust in the market you're selling to. And this is where networks are super important. And then fourth, it's, do they have the capacity to fulfill? And a lot of the things that we've been actually doing as a government is making sure the support we offer tackle those things. So one of the things that it'll please Chris, since the 10th of October, a service we have in the UK, the Export Support Service, covers the whole of the region he's in. He mentioned Ken, the Trade Commissioner, in. And what we recognised is that if you try to interact with government to find out which forms do I need to fill in or what tariffs do I need to pay, it can be an absolute assault course. And what this service is about is come to us, ask us anything. And we have dealt with everything from helping people and holding their hands through form filling into my goods are stuck at the port somewhere else. And we get in touch with our people at Post to say, is there anything you can do to unlock some of these problems? So one of the things we should send out on the back of this session is how businesses online can access those sort of services. And I've got to say, it's a sticking plaster over a very complicated system. And I think Holger was saying, you know, we're miles off a slick operation for international trade, where there's much more digital transfers, much more sort of trusted sharing of data between. I could talk at length about that, but I'll pause there.
So I mean, I think
Paul, can I just reply to Paul?
Sure.
I mean, yeah, you're doing great stuff. I'm very much aware of that. But you know, you also have to include, you know, our networks as well, because we have extensive networks, and you know, we've always had a good relationship with our DIT colleagues, and we want to continue that and build on it. And so again, it's inclusivity that you know, I'm focused on. We have to, you know, link everybody to all the available experience and knowledge that there are in markets, so that you know, we do get the right communication back to exporters.
Very, very good. No, very, very helpful. And I think in all the countries around the world, if what we can do, and I know ICC collaborating between Germany and UK, for example, on digitalisation of trade, because we know if we can get that happening faster, we can actually make a dramatic impact to speed, cost, efficiency, and access of trade. And I think you know, there's something in all of this about if it is about more communication, more collaboration, perhaps where are the areas where more collaboration between nations around the world could help us move faster in terms of international trade? We've talked about digitalization. Any other areas where you'd say much more collaboration would deliver much more value, faster gains? Holger, and then Paul.
Labor force. We are really looking for people working in our companies or hospitality industry. It's a dramatic. It's not only about delays on airplanes. It's all over Germany. So if we might help ourselves with workforce, that would help absolutely.
I must say, Holger, I think that is a fantastic point. If I think about you and I know are both involved in many different business organizations and activities, and the number one issue in every one of them is around people and skills. I mean, there's lots of stuff going on, but if we cannot get the people to provide the service or make the products, there is no business. And I think it's a while since we've thought about how can we get momentum, how can we do more to get access to these skills, because without question, certainly in the UK at the moment, lack of availability of skills is limiting economic growth. Of that, there's no doubt. Chris, you want to come in again? I'm sorry. Yeah.
I mean, on collaboration, here in Turkey, we formed a group of the European chambers before COVID, and it's a very effective platform because, you know, we sit together with, you know, the German chamber and the Austrians and the Dutch and the French and everybody, and we have a meeting every 6 weeks because we have common problems in Turkey. That we feel if we speak with one voice instead of trying to speak independently, we'll probably get more response from the various ministries or whatever than if we spoke independently. And that's a very strong platform, and we're all committed to making sure that our businesses do well in Turkey and the region. And, you know, more collaboration amongst international chambers, I think, is one area that we can work on. But not forgetting, we are competitors, so we have to think about that as well.
Paul, did you want to come in?
Yes. Just one thing I would offer as an observation as well. I mean, we've done quite a bit of analysis, and the report we published last year called the Global Trade Outlook is looking at sort of import demand for UK goods and where the growth sectors are. Two things on that. One, the concept of trade corridors, you know, where you're not sort of just talking about trade in a very broad sense, but you narrow off to, you know, a particular market has a massive demand for something that it wants to source from outside of its country, where you've got sort of comparative advantage. That can be a really strong anchor for all sorts of productive conversations between different governments and different businesses there. So I think having that sharp focus on what are the sectors in particular markets where you think actually there is a fertile ground for dialogue. I think the second thing I would say is, while virtual meetings like this, and you know, we've all done tons of them during COVID, getting back to contact and face-to-face and building trust again in that sort of through trade missions, through big events, and people meeting people. And it's amazing that friendships always strike me as a strong anchor to international trade, as well as the economics of it. And when you're just seeing a face on the screen and you've never met the person and all of that, it's not quite the same. So we certainly will be boosting our presence at trade shows overseas. We'll be boosting the support we give to small businesses to actually get at those shows. So I think that's an opportunity there as well.
Look, I think, Paul, that reinforces, you know, when ICC was founded, it was a small number of people in a room, and they were known as the Merchants of Peace, and it was about personal relationships. We know that that's an absolutely super critical part of it. Listen, I just want to come back to something that Holger raised a moment ago. If we have a common challenge around availability of skills, what practically could we do, or would we like to see as policy changes that could make a difference to that in the short to medium term? So Holger, if you walked into your chancellor this morning and he said, okay, how can I help you? What would you want him to do?
Make these things happen and don't announce it. If I'm lucky having Chris with us, we had this horrible flight chaos throughout the summer. And then we decided to bring in 3,000 airport workers from Turkey. None of them has arrived because of political problems in admissions or whatever. So make these things happen. Don't talk only about them. It is so many opportunities, but make these things happen. Really do it, not only with claiming it.
So yeah, I mean, I think that would announcements don't quite equate to execution, do they? Paul, magic wand on availability of talent and skills. I know it's outside your department, but you will have heard the dialogue. How do you think business should be thinking about approaching this challenge?
You're slightly fortunate. Up until 2016, I spent most of my career on the labour market side of the UK. So I certainly have, I guess, dated insight to that. Just a couple of things, really. I mean, obviously, immigration policy is central to some of this. So businesses being clear about what the need is and what they'd like to see in a targeted immigration policy. I'll not go into the politics of UK-EU and how that led into the vote on the referendum and all of the rest, but certainly migration was a big factor in that. But you know, we are in the UK with probably more vacancies than we've ever seen. Typically, we'd be around 500,000. We're up around close to 1.5. I haven't seen the latest figures. Unemployment is at record low. I mean, there is still economic inactivity in groups in that, where you know there is a job to do to get people re-engaged in the labour market. But you know, you get this sort of you know, either the employers don't want those kind of people, or they don't want those kind of jobs. And I think, frankly, it's how do you make the jobs attractive? if you look at hospitality, we probably all know people who run restaurants or are chefs or do things like that. These are tough jobs. And the number of stories I hear with people walking away from, those sorts of jobs, or even some of the manufacturing jobs, to be an Amazon worker or go and work in a supermarket. So there's something here about, we can't take for granted that the workforce will just sort of show up and take what it's given. So I think there's a bit of a challenge about how you make those jobs attractive to people. And it plays into that sort of comment I think Maria made very early on, is how do we engage people in all of this challenge we've got, so they just don't see it as we're just simply kind of in it for ourselves, and actually we're interested in the broad, people having a reasonable sort of standard of living and those sorts of things as well.
Super comments, Paul. Thank you. Holger, I see your hand up.
Just a short comment. I fully agree with what you mentioned, Paul. And it's not a question of minimum wages, which we installed in Germany throughout the last 18 months, and we raised our wages from 8.7 to 12 euros. It didn't help a little thing. It's just making the jobs or the motivation or the leadership more orientated in a positive way. It's not about minimum wages.
Just a quick one on that one. I was speaking to chambers in the north of England 2 weeks ago. I visited most of them, and their biggest problem with this is, their companies are being robbed of their talented people because there's better salaries elsewhere, which also creates another gap in the company that they come from, which they can't recruit from, if you get my gist. So there is a problem in because there's a shortage, demand exceeds supply, and we're just exacerbating that with high wages because they're just stealing from one another.
So Chris, what's the solution to that?
What's the solution to that? I wish I knew. I'd be a very rich man. But I'm sure we can come up with something at the ICC.
So I think there's a very sort of clear and practical message there from the team, which is around business being clear on a very targeted immigration policy, and at the same time having a strategy to make the jobs and roles attractive. So I think that's a good practical action. I guess if I stick with that theme and say we've started at the beginning today with there's lots and lots of challenges all around us. Some of them are a burning platform in terms of the short term around energy costs and so on. But if you said business is a force for good and we can make a difference and we can help, what more can we as businesses do to help governments in the face of all of this? What do we have to bring to the table that might help overcome some of these challenges? Thoughts, Holger?
Absolutely. Not aggressive decoupling because out of any short-term wishes. Yes, we have to rethink our supply chains, but don't do aggressive decoupling. It is so expensive, and we did some maybe mistakes in relying on cheap energy from Russia, in relying on cheap production force from China. Yes, but let's stay in that context somehow, talk to each other, find ways, and don't do an aggressive decoupling.
So making sure, I mean, that certainly would be, I think, relevant to most of us around the table. The politics at the moment would say that clearly the trading relationship with Russia is suspended.
Yes.
The trading relationship with China is under very high stress due to the Taiwan Straits. So we just turn to the East for a moment and China. What would our advice be, Holger? It would be, look, yes, there's lots to be concerned about, but we need to think about how to mitigate the risks, not walk away. Is that how you be thinking about it?
That's the way. We as humans have two legs to be based on. So I think that's the same. Look for some other sources in the world, and hopefully the second is more resilient. You never know. But that's what we actually see. Everybody's looking for the MENA region, for the Gulf region, for India, these countries around. And yes, that's the right way. But don't do a decoupling of China tomorrow. It might sound great, but it would cause a catastrophe.
Chris, any thoughts?
Just a quick one. I mean, for me, when I look around and talk to businesses, not just in Turkey but in Europe and back in the UK, the key word here is trust. And the world's gone into a position of lacking trust for all sorts of reasons: political, geopolitical, economic, and also within business. And we've got to re-establish trust. And I think that's what the private sector are looking for. They need to understand and trust what the government are doing. They need to understand where the various policies that the government are bringing in are actually working for them. And I think we've lost trust. I think that's a big issue. And my priority would be, we have to start rebuilding trust, both with countries that we deal with on a fair trade basis. And we also have to look at, how we get around the table and talk this through.
So let's just stick with that for a moment, Chris. Easy to say, we need to rebuild trust. What can we as business leaders do so we can call on governments to do what's our role in rebuilding trust?
Well, our role is to work with government and get government to understand why we don't have the trust in either government politics or countries that we no longer want to deal with, and that affects supply chain. So again, it's a question of sitting down and putting these issues on the table and working out a strategy that will actually enable us to go to our counterparts in other countries and explain to them why we have problems with trust in their businesses or trust in their politics. It's not an easy one by any means, but we have to start, and I think that's the biggest issue we face.
So as business leaders, what I hear you saying is we have to speak truth to power. If we're not satisfied with the way we're being governed, if we're not satisfied with government policy, we need to speak up and speak out.
Yes, absolutely.
And how good a job do you think we're doing globally at that at the moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at, as you mentioned earlier, the governments around the world that have moved to nationalism, protectionism, and what should I say? I don't want to use the word, but who are blocking that sort of dialogue. And the important thing is we have to work on how we can overcome that.
Listen, I'm going to come to Paul in a moment, just for the benefit of the audience. I mean, we're having a great time here trying to solve world hunger and all the other challenges. But if any of you out there in the audience have got questions, please do fire them up. The instructions, I think, are on your screen. And I'll pass the question to whoever I think will give you the best possible answer. But Paul, I saw your hand waving there.
Yeah, just a couple of quick thoughts. You mentioned, obviously, trade with China. I came back from a 4-year tour in Hong Kong last April, so a lot of experience of the region, obviously also living through the protests and the implications of that. Couple of thoughts from me. You'll hear a term within government circle of clear-eyed relationship. And I think what that amounts to in a practical sense is, you can see balance between the economic value of a strong economic relationship, but you're not about to turn a blind eye to things you don't agree with. Now, we all know in certain cultures and certain countries, they can't necessarily deal with that. You're either my friend or you're not, and that's a line we're walking, I think, at the moment. Again, to your point, and I think I agree with Chris here around the trust. Former chairman of the ICC, Victor Fung, who is based in Hong Kong, has lots of done a lot for international trade in the business community. And I think, you know, the insight, again, that your organization and the other business groups in those markets can bring is invaluable. And the one thing that struck me from quite a few panels I've been on recently is, our businesses investing enough in getting a reliable readout of the geopolitics, or are they just relying on, you know, that whatever the press are writing? And I think that's going to be increasingly, if you're going to have a clear-eyed relationship, you've got to have good insight from those markets.
Look, Paul, I think that's a great point and very, very helpful, because we know in business that when we're selling to our customers and we're taking from suppliers, particularly these big dominant relationships, we're always very clear-eyed when we're doing that. You know, we're thinking about, you know, if you have a major customer that's 40% of your total business, being clear-eyed about the risks of that are to be considered, as well as all the opportunity. And similarly on the supply side, and I think COVID has probably alerted us all to putting all your bets on one horse maybe isn't the smartest thing to do in a highly interdependent world. I think that's a really good point, Paul. I'm obviously we have a very shy audience so far, so I'm going to turn to a question that is really on everyone's mind around the world, and that is climate change. And I'm not looking for you to pull out the standard brief Q&A on climate change, but you know, if we were as business leaders, if this was our number one priority and number one challenge, what are the 2 or 3 practical things we might do to dramatically accelerate the pace of progress on climate change? I've never known a German hesitate on this question, but I'm going to go to Chris first.
Well, my person, I'm very passionate about this, and I sit on a couple of boards who are deeply involved. And it's getting people to understand that they don't have a choice. This is not a choice. I mean, you're either in or you're out. And, you know, it's been proven, you know, from COP26 and hopefully 27, that, you know, if you're not involved, if you don't have policies, if you don't have ESG, and if you don't engage, then your business will suffer economically, because, you know, the financial services sector, banks and investors will not provide you with funding if you've not actually embedded global sustainability and ESG in your organizations. And you know, this is something that business have to seriously think about. You can't rely just on government, you know, taking the lead. I mean, governments will give you an outline plan and a strategy, but it's the businesses that have to actually make it happen. And you know, this is where the focus has to be. And right. We need more business leaders engaging with real initiatives to make this happen.
So just to, I'm going to come to Holger in just one second, but my real question is, that's of course what we would say, wouldn't we, if I looked at this, and I think the question is, so what can we do together, not as individual businesses, but as a global business community, to achieve a step change in progress, as opposed to more good stuff? But Holger, I'll come to you and back to Chris in a minute.
Absolutely. I think it's some kind of giving a good example. It's somewhat of talking about carbon emissions. Talk about it. Talk into your company. Who has the best idea? Talk to your kids. What can we do in the family? I think it's really doing these things and talking about them, giving good examples, great leadership, and by giving good examples. I would say, in what we try inside our companies is talking about this. What can we really do? Where can we shut off the light at 6 o'clock in the evening? In which corner? What can we reduce car travel? Can we reduce the airline traffic? If not, we pay something for it. So I think it's really in discussing these things, and as you mentioned, Paul, before, not waiting for politics until they give us an advice how we should operate it.
Paul,
Yeah, I mean, I think two things I would bring out here. One, giving investors a bit of regulatory certainty to where we're going with this, because I think we can all see opportunities of a bright future with less carbon. But regulatory certainty is one of the things I've observed that unlocks quite a bit of investment. So, you know, big debate around the use of hydrogen in the future, where particularly in the UK. So where will that land? And I think that so regulatory certainty unlocks, I think, a huge amount of capital investment, which is what you need to get from A to B. I think the second thing I would say is actually the real innovation is going to come from businesses themselves. You know, when the UK declared that offshore wind was going to provide, you know, it set a target for that, the market raced way ahead of politicians' ambitions because they thought this is the direction of travel. Now, what you don't want is then, oh, we're going somewhere else now because, you know, people have put a stake on that. So I think a bit of certainty from governments on where they see the future, where they would want to regulate some of those sort of assets that one could invest in. And I think that's a big help in helping unlock, you know, the sort of innovation that could come from it.
Very, look, interested. I have a question in, is there more top tier companies can do to implement climate action through global supply chains? And I was just going to reflect on what the three of you said. I am really reflecting deeply on COVID-19 and thinking about how fantastic was it that we designed, developed, manufactured, distributed, and executed vaccines to billions of people so quickly. And to my mind, it was partly about the fact we decided we had a burning platform. It was a real crisis. We couldn't wait around, and therefore we're very focused on what do we need to do. And the reality is we delivered a vaccine probably in 1/10 of the time we would have done in the normal course of business. And I guess there's a bit of a question to my mind is, you know, at what point in time will we decide climate change warrants the same degree of intensity and urgency that something like COVID-19 did? Because we know, I mean, history tells us, in the face of massive adversity, business is pretty good. Any thoughts?
I mean, if I may, the thing that struck me is how much is invested in today and how you get through the journey to tomorrow. And can you know, or is this going to be the end of some business interests and the creation of new ones? And of course it is, but it's, I think what some of what holds that back in my sense is just people maintaining their share of the pie on the journey. You know, no one's going to give their lunch away on this one. So that it's the thinking that through that I think a lot of businesses have to grapple with.
Holger?
Fully agree. Just like to come back a little bit on what you mentioned before, Paul. Not waiting for politics, and but we need politics in give us a regulation about, and we need politics in investing in this. We, for example, charging stations for cars. In my country, it's essential that this transmission doesn't work at this quantity of charging stations. And now everybody is waiting who will pay for it. And we will lose another 12 or 24 months instead of that the state is jumping in that gap and doing a financing for at least these 12 or 24 months and then taking the money back. Fully agreed, but having a system installed that might help climate change at least to break a little bit.
Just a moment, Chris. I'm now getting questions in. They're coming so fast. I'm losing people. Question: should top-tier companies take a more directive approach on digitalisation and climate action, using their purchasing power as a tool for change? Holger?
Absolutely. I think that the that the big companies all respect their responsibility, and I really believe in that. I think it's more having the Mittelstand, the SMEs all over Europe aligned on this. And maybe, yes, everybody knows, but these facts, as you mentioned it before, I think, Paul, that there will be no more loans or credits from banks if I don't stick to the ESG rules. And additionally, later on, there will be no more insurances for us. So there are so many problems. This needs to be communicated and understood, I think, especially by the Mittelstand in all of our countries, and absolutely not in only my one.
So just before I see Chris's hand, but Holger, while you're on, Kim Chalmer is asking, Dr. Bigman, your point about not decoupling global trade, specifically referencing China, how do you all, however, see the need to increase regional local trade rather than relying too heavily on global trade, global supply chains as done historically?
Short answer in order of time. You have to do both. Stay with the Chinas. Have a look on your supply chains and have a second sourcing secured in order to have two legs to stand on that one.
Thank you, Chris. You wanted to come in?
Yeah, I mean, on big corporates, they do have a role to play, and I spent 20 years with Coca-Cola, so I know what we've been doing over the years, and not just recently. And they've been making big changes on their carbon footprint, but there's not enough people know about what big business are actually doing. And that needs more communication. If we want to show examples of what big business is doing, then there are plenty of them around, but they're not really being communicated. And big business has to do more on that to actually show that they're leading the way. So that's something we need to do. But the other area that I just want to mention, I'm really positively enthused by the young generation. You talk to young people, and they know about climate change. They want to see things moving, and they're the people that will actually make it happen. So we've got to do more to encourage the young voice. Get them with a louder voice, talking about what their expectations.
Absolutely.
And education as well.
The sooner they're in charge, the better, in my view. Can I bring Chris Southworth in, Director General of the ICC in the UK? Chris, if you can sort of join the group, I'm going to try and bring us to a close in a few moments. But anything you want to add to what you've heard, or any questions you want to bring in from the audience?
I think this conversation is just incredibly relevant. I mean, some of the questions you've already answered. I just to pick up on Chris's point just now. I mean, I think what we hear all the time is exactly that. Actually, there are some great examples out there of big top tier companies and other companies, SMEs too, who are doing some brilliant work. And I think that's a role for the likes of ICC and other organizations to make sure that we do more to highlight what that best practice looks like. And we'll certainly be doing that either over the course of this week and beyond as we lead into COP27 and into next year. But I think that's one area where we can really add a lot of value. What I hear an awful lot at the moment is this opportunity to look at this as an innovation challenge. It's not just a sort of a burdensome thing that we have to do. There is a way to deliver this and deliver it at the same time as making the whole global value chain become more innovative at the same time. I was very struck last week talking to Anglo-American who are designing, huge mining trucks. That's not their job. They're not a manufacturer of mining trucks, but they've delivered the first 500-ton hydrogen cell truck because they have to for their business. But it's actually driving innovation back through manufacturing supply chains in other areas, the automotive in that case. So I think there are big opportunities about the way we frame it, the way we look at it, and then the way we encourage it and foster it through organizations like ourselves.
Well, look, I'm mindful of the time and Chris Woods to take the charge in a couple of minutes. If just sort of reflect on so what I've heard around the table this morning from Maria onwards is perhaps if ever there was a time for the International Chamber of Commerce to have an important role in the progress and development of the world, it's now. That we have got to reform the multilateral trading system. We've got to approach it with pride and enthusiasm. I think I've heard from all the panel that business has a vital role to play. We need to speak up. We need to speak out. We need to, as Paul said, we need to be very clear what it is we want and need. And I think you said that particularly in terms of people and skills, but across the board, if business can set out clearly what it wants from government and what it doesn't want, that I think can be helpful. I think on climate change, we're unambiguous about the need for action, that businesses can do a lot by themselves, but perhaps through the International Chamber, we can be thinking about what more can we do as a global community to accelerate the rate of progress beyond being brilliant at talking about it. We were encouraged to think about what regulations are getting in the way of progress. Again, I think that's pretty important. And I think a really important point that I picked up, Chris, through all of this was, we know there's a lot going on geopolitically. We're very aware of it. However, what we don't want are instant reactions, shooting from the hip, as Holger said, just decoupling from long-term relationships, approaching it with eyes wide open, as Chris talked about, but actually managing those relationships in a constructive and positive way, not instant solutions and indeed long-term harm. And we talked about that particularly in terms of China. And there was a very strong realization that digitalisation is a source of fantastic opportunity, that we need to seize it. The biggest prize will go to the small and medium-sized firms, and we need to think about how can we help them to achieve that. So look, Chris, I'm going to hand over to you to close and say thank you to this brilliant panel, but also our sponsors, if you could.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul, and thank you so much to our panel. It's so interesting listening to different perspectives from different parts of the world and from government. In your case too, Paul, I think that's important that we understand where our government's coming from in order to know how to respond really effectively. So thank you so much. Thank you particularly to you, Paul, for moderating the session. I hope we've all gathered some practical and interesting, useful insights from our boardrooms, or a selection of those boardrooms that we interact with. I think it's really perfect timing for me to now ask Chris Woods to come on screen. Chris is representing JTI, one of our platinum sponsors, alongside Monetigo for the week, and then Enigio also sponsoring the week. You know, I think there are a few big corporates like JTI who are probably shipping more products across borders than many other companies. So there's few who know this more and what the implications are and what the opportunities are. I think that's a really important point to stress than Chris. So Chris, if I can hand over to you, and then I'll wrap up the first day and prepare us all for the next 3 days.
Thank you very much, Chris. A lot of Chris's on the call today. Good morning from a sunny and warm Switzerland, and perhaps if it stayed that way for the next 6 months, at least some of our worries would disappear. As we've already heard, we're facing political and economic uncertainty on a global scale. In 2 years, we've gone from relative abundance to scarcity. The COVID-19 pandemic was the first major blow. It was a massive shock to supply chains, and the outbreak of war in Ukraine has dispelled any notion of return to pre-pandemic normal. Until recently, the offshoring of manufacturing seemed like a given. The interdependencies we built into our global supply chains, which many had hoped would guarantee economic growth and stability, have, to some extent, become an Achilles heel. Even minor disruptions caused tremendous backlogs, grinding supply chains to a halt. The grounding of the Ever Given in the Suez Canal was a stark reminder of how fragile our supply chains can be. The global shortage of microchips, impacting many industries, including our own, has been felt by consumers from the non-availability of games consoles, my children, to cars and business models have faltered. We're navigating through political challenges, international sanctions, extreme weather scenarios, financial crises, pandemics, soaring inflation, and possible recession. I think it's true to say our glass is half full of challenges. All this creates an uncertain and challenging economic outlook. And as Maria mentioned this morning, really not helped by the cycle of 24/7 news and the dramatization that comes with it. New realities mean changed obligations and responsibilities for everyone. How good or bad the future is will depend on three things: the flexibility of business to adapt to changing circumstances, government policies, and trust, as has already been mentioned this morning. Let me elaborate on these points. The flexibility of business. Post-COVID, the era of just-in-time supply chains seems over. But that does not mean reshoring manufacturing is the solution. Unlike some other manufacturers, the pandemic had minimal impact on our supply chain. That's because we favor availability and flexibility ahead of pure cost optimization. We continue to believe in and utilize the advantages of the global economy. All our production facilities produce for both their local markets and for export. We've not always been perfect. In 2011, we faced massive disruption due to the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. We were heavily reliant on specific materials and components from a single source. We had no choice but to adapt our supply chain quickly. It taught us an important lesson. A resilient business cannot rely on a single source or geography. Perhaps this is obvious, but how often does business repeat the failings of the past? Our factory in Switzerland is a good example of flexibility, where we manufacture goods for export, something made possible because of excellent bilateral trade agreements. We also plan for spare manufacturing capacity to meet short notice changes in demand. Labour regulations also help. We can boost staffing with posted workers from our EU factories. As with many industries, COVID was a catalyst for flexible working hours and working from home, made possible by the incredible global advances in technology over the last 20 years. We've embraced the positives into our current practices and today operate 50-50 office-home approach for many of our office-based staff, something that would almost certainly not have happened without the pandemic. So business needs to continually adapt, and not only driven by crises, but also the evolving demands of a new generation of employees. But there are some things we can't plan for or do alone. And that brings me to the second point, government policy, particularly in a time of crisis. In March 2020, the South Africa government imposed a total ban on the sale of tobacco and alcohol, neglecting the industry's warnings about devastating consequences of such a measure. The result was predictably disastrous, and not only to industry. Demand for legal products dropped to zero overnight. Prohibition was a gift for organized crime, which has become embedded in the fabric of society, costing the government of South Africa an estimated $300 to $5 million in lost taxes for tobacco alone. What happened in South Africa is a textbook example of unintended consequences of poor policy. Poor policy is one thing, but inconsistent application and enforcement is another. As responsible businesses, we all invest in infrastructure, people, and processes to comply with regulations. We should not be disadvantaged for this. Governments need to do more and work together with business to protect consumers and legitimate global supply chains. Policies should increase resilience of supply chains. When goods cannot flow freely, it can lead to a dramatic cost increase and product shortages and the opportunity for illegal supply. And there's a strong financial rationale for taking action. World Bank estimates that illegal cigarettes alone cost 40 to 50 billion a year in lost revenue for governments, And the total value of illicit trade, counterfeit goods across all industries, is estimated at a staggering $4 trillion. We're facing a tough winter in Europe. We understand the need to conserve energy, and companies are working together to tackle the energy crisis. And that's vital, because if we don't, governments risk making arbitrary decisions about what industry sector is essential, and the downsides could be costly. We need evidence-based energy policies that protect legal producers and do not create fertile ground for illegal manufacturers. Governments should invest in and encourage infrastructure that supports local development and manufacturing. And that, of course, means removing barriers to execution, helping companies adapt supply routes, embracing digitalisation, and cutting red tape. Addressing these challenges requires everyone's involvement. But no one underestimates the challenges facing governments, the choices they face, and the difficulty in making the right decisions. And that brings me to my final point, trust. And that's trust ending in a T, in case my diction is not all that clear. Chris Gaunt has already made excellent points only a few minutes ago, and I couldn't agree more. Trust in public institutions has been steadily declining, while trust in business has been rising. One recent survey showed trust in government at the lowest end of the scale, while trust in military at the highest. I have to say, I do find this a little concerning. Another recent OECD analysis highlights the importance of coordination and coherence among governments, and consultation and cooperation between the public and private sectors. We need to create platforms for governments and businesses to act together. Trust is established when all stakeholders are heard in a transparent way. Businesses across industries need to make their views heard by policymakers. Associations like the ICC are pivotal in championing our shared interests. ICC UK has been leading the way in bringing businesses together and voicing a united business front. There's a word in Japanese, kaizen, simply translated as continuous improvement. And now more than ever, continuous improvement is needed by business and government alike. And if we're all honest, probably in each of us as well. Thank you for letting me speak today, and thank you for all the discussions that I've listened to this morning. They're enlightening.
Thanks very much, Chris, and wise words there. There's quite a number of points, aren't there, that we're going to be picking up in the next 3 days. So we're now going to shift focus tomorrow with our next session at 9 a.m. On preserving nature and the environment for future generations. That's been touched on, the importance of the next generation coming on. We'll be talking about that exactly in the morning. But a huge thank you to you, Chris, for wrapping up day one. I hope all of our listeners and watchers got a good insight into the big picture that frames the rest of the week. Now it's all about the solutions. What can we do? Being constructive and positive, to Paul's point a little bit earlier on. And I think this point around ICC as a convening force is certainly something that we've seen huge benefits from in the UK, but also at global level with initiatives like the ICC Digital Standards Initiative, which again, we're going to hear more about on Wednesday morning. But those kind of public-private partnerships, businesses working together, has got to be at the center of all the solutions going forward if we're going to tackle these long-term challenges together. But the opportunities are clearly there. So can I just give a final thank you to our partners? I've already thanked sponsors. We shouldn't forget our partners in this conference, which include Global Policy House, Trade Finance Global, Global Trade Review or GTR, Reset Connect, and I should stress 30 of our ICC teams around the world. It's a great privilege to work with our ICC teams who are right at the thick of it in varying parts of the world. So it's fantastic to be working alongside them. So thank you very much for participating in day one. Again, 9 a.m. British Standard Time is the next session tomorrow morning. That will be focused on preserving nature and the environment for future generations, and look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.